my philosophy with fertilizer is only apply what is needed, when it's needed, and choose the correct formulation. So it's all about timing and formulations and getting things precise. And you know, the more you hone in on it, the more money you're going to save by not putting out stuff you don't need to put out or at the wrong time. So the first thing I want everyone to understand is that not all nutrients are taken up or moving around in the soil the same way. I'm going to give you a couple examples here to give you some food for thought about what you should be thinking about. Nutrients that move with water solution, we call this the mass flow. This is water moving into the soil and nutrients getting caught up in the solution of the water and moving with the water wherever the water moves. That's mass flow. So nitrate would be an example of this. Nitrate's a form of nitrogen that's soluble and moves around with water. So let's say you wanted to fertilize your vineyard with nitrogen and it was going to be raining soon. You could put out a nitrate-based fertilizer on the soil surface and let it get rained into the soil, and that would then bring it to the roots below the soil surface and allow better uptake. Or you could apply a nitrate fertilizer through your drip irrigation system, and that would be called fertigation. And that way, whether it's raining or not, you could apply that fertilizer and move it exactly where you want it to go. So how about potassium or phosphate over here? We've got potassium. These are nutrients that are absorbed by contact of growing roots. So this is called diffusion. It's different from mass flow. So as you probably know, you have acid soils where you are in the east, where I'm presenting to this audience here today. So you probably put lime out into the soil. And you know, if you just put lime on top of the soil, the calcium sits on the top of the soil. It doesn't move with water into the soil. It's going to move through diffusion. It's going to be absorbed by diffusion. So that's why you have to incorporate the lime with some tillage to get it down into the root zone. Same thing with potassium, same thing with phosphorus. They'll sit on the surface. However, potassium will move a little bit better than phosphorus and calcium. So what has to happen is you have to have roots that grow through the soil over time and intercept with these nutrients or these cations or anions in the soil. So that should happen naturally and theoretically over time as roots expand and grow every season. They're going to contact new fertilizer. Also through mycorrhizal affiliations, which are fungi that can essentially lengthen the area of a root by connecting with it and forming haustoria and forming hyphae that can then mine the soil for phosphorus, potassium, and some other nutrients. So know how your fertilizers move and what nutrients are moving with mass flow versus those that need to be contacted through a process called diffusion. And of course, take your plant test. You can do leaf or petiole. I tend to do whole leaf analysis for my growers, but I will do petiole when I have a problem and I need to look at it through two different magnifying glasses. I'll do both petiole and leaf. The petiole and leaf analysis are great because they tell us within the season a snapshot of what our plants are able to take up out of the soil. The soil is important to sample maybe once every 3 years just to get a baseline. And I think of that as the bank account. The soil is the bank account. It tells you what's available for plant uptake. And then the vine plant tissue is going to tell you if it was able to make a withdrawal from the ATM. Okay, that's a good test to do. And if you want some good guidelines on whole leaf analysis, use the Pacific Northwest Extension publication that I'm showing here. I'll give you the slides for this. This has some basic standard results for bloom and veraison that you should be expecting for whole leaf. I use a little modified version of this depending on the regions I'm working in and the problems we have, but this is a good starting point. Same thing here, there's a good guide in the Wine Grape Production Guide for Eastern North America by Tony Wolf. You guys might have a copy of this already. Hopefully you do. It has a great table for looking at standards for petioles. Okay, but just remember how the nutrient demand works for vines. Okay, the majority of nutrient demand is from bud break or bud burst to bloom when shoot growth is most rapid. But most growers do not sample tissue until bloom. So this is why it's important to do a sample at bloom, because it gives you kind of like your progress report for the season. But the report card at the end of the season, or that midway point at veraison, is the most important one. I always tell people, if you're only going to sample one time a year, petiole or leaf tissue, do it at veraison. What I try and encourage everyone to do is to do it both at bloom and at veraison, so you get the whole picture of your season. So late season sampling can tell the grower what is needed to meet demands from bud burst to bloom, okay? And for the following season. So you can look at the late season results and then say, oh boy, you know, we really didn't nail it this year on magnesium. We need to add more next year earlier. So you can put down magnesium before bloom the next year, or after fruit set, or immediately before you get those petiole results at bloom. And so this is a useful tool. So if you can only sample one time, sample at veraison. I would say sample more. That's a nutrient sample that's more representative of the whole season, and then you can make adjustments. You can still fertilize after veraison if you have to. If you have a micronutrient deficiency, or if you're low on magnesium, you can put it out through the drip irrigation and get it into the vineyard quickly if you use fertigation. And I'm going to get to that, but just remember, not only are nutrients going to move differently in the soil, but they're going to be available from the soil at different times of the year. So this is just a nice quick graph I'm going to show on nitrogen availability. And what I'm showing is at dormancy, the red line shows you the vine's demand in red for nitrogen. So at bud break, we start increasing demand, and at bloom, we peak our nitrogen demand. So that means if we have a nitrogen deficiency in the vineyard, we want to apply it before bloom in order to meet this major uptake curve. We could probably apply a little again near veraison. Typically, I'll do foliar at that point if we have a need for it, because there's an increased demand around veraison. And then the blue line just shows you availability of nitrogen from the breakdown of organic matter in the soil. That increases as the soil warms up and decreases as the season goes on. So what's nice about the blue line and red line here is it shows you that even if we don't fertilize with nitrogen, if you have a high organic soil, I should say if you have a soil with high organic matter and plenty of moisture to move the nitrogen around, and it's warm enough, that means you're probably getting the nitrogen that you need just from the soil alone. And that's why when I do work in Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, we very rarely apply nitrogen, because we generally get what we need from the soil. But there are cases where it shows low in plant tests, and we'll put a small amount out through the drip. Okay, so how do you decide what fertilizers to put out? Here's an example of a plant test that I got back from A&L Eastern, which is now Waypoint Analytical. And this one showed that sulfur and magnesium are both low. So I ask you all as a class, if sulfur is low and magnesium is low, and you need to choose a fertilizer that will give you both sulfur and magnesium, what fertilizer can we use? Ding, 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 ding. If you're all saying magnesium sulfate, you're correct. That will be a good choice of fertilizer because we need both sulfur and magnesium. How about if we're short on calcium and short on nitrogen? Is there a nitrogen that has calcium in it, or is there a calcium? Sure. There's something called calcium nitrate, and you put that on the soil surface, and that could, or you could just put a regular nitrogen fertilizer and then add lime for your calcium if that were the case. So there's different ways you can figure out what formulations are best. And I'm going to show you some case studies, because in the last little bit of time I have here, I want to make sure you kind of get an idea and a feel for how a vineyard consultant like myself will look at these tissue results and then make recommendations. And because I was asked to focus on drip applied fertilizers, the rest of my presentation will specifically outline fertilizers that are applied through the drip system. So here's the first case study. This is from the Texas Hill Country. It doesn't matter where it's from. We're just going to look at the nutrients and find out what was low. Okay, the lab test came back, and in yellow and in the red boxes, I've highlighted some tissue samples in a Malbec and in Alicante that are showing low in magnesium. We have 0.18 and 0.19%. We want to be at least 0.25%. Okay, so magnesium is low. Nitrogen, phosphorus, NPK, they're all fine. They were doing fine in this vineyard. Calcium, fine. We have high pH soil. Boron was fine. We're getting that in the water too. Zinc was low, not crazy low, but it was 20 and 22 instead of 25 to 100 parts per million, so it was on the low end. And then iron was a little low. We want to keep it above 75 parts per million. If you're in a low pH soil, like in a reddish, iron-rich soil, probably iron deficiency is not going to be a problem for you. But here we can see it in some of these areas with calcareous soil. So below were my recommendations to this grower. This is an actual client and actual recommendations that I made. I told them, through your drip irrigation, you can apply, right after fruit set, 30 pounds per acre of magnesium sulfate. That's Epsom salt. That's going to give you magnesium and sulfur. I told them they can mix with that 2 quarts per acre of Pro Zinc 10, which has 8% nitrogen and some zinc in it, a chelated zinc, and then put out 2 pounds per acre of an EDDHA chelated iron, which is a good one for high pH soils. And that one's called Fertilizzer by Villagra. And then I told them, make sure you sample again at Verasion, and then we can see, did this work? And lo and behold, here's what we found at Verasion. Okay, so we now can focus on those deficiencies. The magnesium sulfate we put through the drip seemed to work. We brought the magnesium levels well over 0.25%. The zinc we put down seemed to work, more so in the Alicante than the Malbec. Uptake was better, can't explain why. But again, this wasn't a scientific experiment with lots of completely randomized, replicated samples. This was just a whole block where we sampled before we fertilized and sampled again after. So it's what we call a grower field study. And to me, it's good enough for helping a grower because it shows me that we basically brought everything that was deficient back into a reasonable range. Now, the cool thing is, because we applied those Epsom salts through the drip irrigation, which you can do, and then you flush the lines with water, we were able to apply about 10% of the rate that you would need to apply on the surface of the soil and then hope that it would get rained in, right? So we saved a lot of money on fertilizer, we economized on that, and then we're able to get it immediately into the soil because we're pushing it with the irrigation water. Okay, and then Fertilizzer is one of the products that I use. So I'm just showing you a few of the products just for examples. I use probably 20 different products through irrigation, and I'm always looking for others to fit specific soil situations. But Fertilizzer is a good iron if you need some iron. It's a EDDHA chelated, so it's good for high pH soils for uptake. The Pro Zinc 10 is a chelated zinc solution. Again, 2 quarts per acre, very small amounts, and they provide a little nitrogen as well. Kor was a fertilizer that I've used in vineyards as well, which is a sprayable nitrogen. And I was mentioning earlier that if you wanted to apply nitrogen without causing vigor, we know from studies at Cornell University, Tim Martinson was involved with years ago, that if you spray urea or certain types of nitrogen, that will help you with your yeast assimilable nitrogen at harvest, which is important for winemaking, but it doesn't increase vigor in the vines. So this is one way. If you have low YAN levels, yeast assimilable nitrogen, you can apply nitrogen as a foliar feed. Now, it can get hot in a lot of the climates we grow grapes, so we don't want to spray urea when it's 90-something degrees out, but this product, Kor, is a urea-based product with a little bit of other soluble nitrogen, and it's slowly available nitrogen, which means it's not going to burn the leaves as badly, so it's a little safer. And that's why I like to recommend it when we're foliar applying nitrogen. Okay, let me give you one other example of some recommendations I made, because this one shows magnesium, iron, and nitrogen deficiency in a Texas Gulf Coast hybrid vineyard. So in this one, I gave almost the same exact recommendations. Why? Because it was working well. But I added a gallon per acre of NPAC liquid nitrogen, which is about 26% nitrogen liquid, because our nitrogen was below 2.5%. And remember, these are whole leaf samples. They should be above 2.5. So what did we find out afterwards? We brought our nitrogen at Verasion back up over 3%. And by the way, 1 gallon of 26% nitrogen gives you approximately 2.6 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's a sprinkle, that's nothing, okay? So we're just putting enough out to boost what's needed in the plant, but not cause excess vigor. The magnesium sulfate worked. It brought everything back over 0.25 through the drip. We can mix those all together and put them out at once. And the iron didn't really seem to move. I think there's some iron binding or tying up going on in the soil. Not quite sure what it was, but it was a heavier clay soil. So I suspect that was the case. But anyway, overall, we improved the situation in the vineyard, and we did it with a very, what I consider the most minimal amount of fertilizer needed. And to me, that's a win. So there you go. There's where we're able to change, and the iron, not so much. Okay, NPACT is the product I was using through the drip there. This is a little bit more expensive than your standard urea or 3200 UAN nitrogen, and it's also a slower release, slower available nitrogen. So if a site has a tendency to be vigorous, but we're low in nitrogen, I prefer to use a slower release nitrogen in the soil, same as I do on the foliage. Okay, and here's just a table I put together to give you all an idea of uptake of fertilizers based on application methods. The soil surface, if you don't have irrigation and you're just going to apply all of your fertilizer to the soil surface, you can expect that most of your uptake is going to be slow because you need rain to move these things into the soil. So for slow uptake, we would say apply well before peak demand. So don't wait until you have a deficiency and then try to put fertilizer out on the ground, because you're going to need a rainfall right away to make sure it gets taken into vines. If you want something to go in more quickly, use your drip irrigation, because nitrogen, magnesium, boron are all going to go in relatively quickly with irrigation. And then even things that don't move quickly through soil, like potassium and zinc, they will move if you push them down with irrigation water. And then, of course, you have the ability, if you don't have an irrigation system, to do some foliar sprays. They're more of a Band-Aid cure. They don't really correct the imbalance if there's a soil imbalance, but they will help the plants get through a tough stage. So for fast uptake, apply just before peak demand or if deficiency symptoms are present. So just a little table for you. I'll be glad to share this with you through email as well. And of course, if you are going to inject stuff into the system, there are very simple setups that you can build yourself that are going to cost you, less than $200. A Mazzei injector is an example where you just basically install a gate valve downstream of your pump, and you create this this kind of outflow and back inflow. And this Mazzei injector is a restricted plastic that forms a cone. So as the water passes through that restriction, it creates suction, and that's why that tube is there. That tube goes down into a bucket. Just picture a 5-gallon plastic bucket that you have a liquid fertilizer in, and it's going to suck out of that bucket and bring it right back in to the flow. And you can turn it off with these valves, and then you can either filter or not filter, depending on what you're putting out into the field. If I was going to inject like a compost tea or some kind of a biological product, I would probably do a coarse filter to make sure I wasn't plugging up my emitters. And of course, there are dosatrons or mixed right type of injector systems you can buy. They're a little more expensive. We're getting into $500 to $1,000 to do a setup with one of these, but the nice thing is they are more of a metered product, so you can have more control over the speed and the rate that your product goes out. So if you're applying an insecticide, you need to check with your local state regulations. You may actually have to have a diaphragm pump or some type of a metered system in order to put out an insecticide. Typically for fertilizers, that's not required. So the Mazzei system before would work fine for just fertilizer. With an example of a maintenance rate fertilizer program that you could use in a vineyard where you were needing a little nitrogen, some micronutrients, and a little bit of magnesium. So let's say you were going to do your first injection. Typically, the best time, if you don't have a deficiency in your vineyard and you just want to put out a maintenance rate, would be at about 12-inch shoots, because at that point you have about 6 fully unfolded leaves. The leaves are transpiring and they're sucking moisture into the roots. That means if you fertigate, you're going to suck the fertilizer into the roots. So that's why we started at about 12-inch shoots. We do nitrogen at about, in this example, 3 to 5 units. That would be 1 to 1.5 gallons of 32% liquid nitrogen. Let's say you wanted to find a micronutrient blend so you can get some micronutrients into the vines before bloom, so you can improve your fruit set. I use a product called Axilo BMZ, A-X-I-L-O BMZ. It's got boron, molybdenum, zinc, and manganese. There are many, many products out there. I'm just giving one example. And humic acid is something I like to drip out in low organic matter soils. And when I'm dripping out cations, because humic acid is a complex organic, let's say liquid, it's basically like a liquid compost, and it's something that you can run through a drip irrigation system. So I think of it as liquid compost with these complex molecules that help hold on to nutrients, and maybe if you want to compare it to helping the cation exchange of the soil temporarily, it may do that. So I sometimes put out a half to a gallon of hydrohume, which is a hell of a product. There's some other ones out there as well. Then I would go back after fruit set. If my report showed I was low in magnesium and needed a little more nitrogen, you could follow up immediately after fruit set with your 25 or 30 pounds of magnesium sulfate. If you need a little iron or nitrogen or a little humic acid at that point, you could put that out too. So again, just an example to bring it all together so you can see how you can put together a program, how you can time the program, how you can use your historical plant data to know what you should be putting into a maintenance program. And it's important, again, to do your plant tissue test every year at bloom and at veraison. I don't care if you're doing petiole or whole leaf or leaf blade, but it's important to get those standards. And then I've got a nice chart that I'm going to share with the class. If you email me, I'll send you this as well. It tells you which fertilizers are compatible and which ones are going to cause a big old honking mess inside your tank and gum everything up and ruin your whole irrigation system. So it's important to know this stuff too. And then I've got another bonus I'm going to give everyone here today, which is some equations on how to determine the amounts of fertilizer to put out, whether you're putting out a solid fertilizer, a liquid fertilizer, and then if you have nitrogen in your water, it's important to understand if you're irrigating how much nitrogen goes out just with your irrigation water. So if you do irrigate, please, please, please test your irrigation water, find out how much nitrates are in there, find out if you have salts, find out what your total dissolved salts are, your sodium absorption ratio, and how much boron you have in the water, because a lot of those things can be toxic in large amounts. And then of course, if you're using compost, the best time to put that out is in the fall. It's better to incorporate it into the soil and make sure that you don't lose a lot of the nitrogen to volatilization, and that gets those microbes into the soil from the compost. If you need a calculator on how to determine compost rates, I do have one on the Virtual Viticulture Academy website. So those of you who are thinking in the back of your mind, this guy never mentioned organic fertilizer at all. Ha! I gotcha. I'm gonna make sure I give you information on how to apply and how much to apply compost, for an example, in your vineyard. And then of course, one last thing for those of you, because a lot of you are newer growers or thinking about growing, you may not see potassium deficiency in your soils very often, but when vines are young, remember, the roots have to come in contact with potassium to take it up in the vines. So young vines may have a different nutrient requirement than what's normal in your region. So you hear consultants say, don't add potassium because it increases the pH of the fruit and it throws off the magnesium, and that's true. But if you have a really young vine, in the first year or two, you might need to put down a small amount of potassium, and that potassium should be long gone by the time your vines are in production. So these roots have a very small box. Nitrogen leaches, potassium doesn't leach as much, phosphorus doesn't leach much at all. But remember, heavy rainfall years, you may actually have to apply some nitrogen in low organic matter soils. So there we go, your 4 inches. A lot of people apply fertilizer to the top 4 inches, but you really have to work it in to the soil if it's going to be a slow moving product like phosphorus or potassium.